The year is 30 BCE. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, is holding an asp, a venomous snake, in her trembling hands. Outside her palace, Roman soldiers are breaking down the doors. 3,000 years of pharaonic rule, the most magnificent civilization the world has ever known, is about to die with her. But here's the kicker. This wasn't some sudden collapse. This was a 3,000-year-long game of civilizational Jenga, and we're about to watch every single block that brought down the house. Welcome back to the channel that makes history hit harder than your morning coffee. I'm about to take you on a wild ride through the rise and catastrophic fall of ancient Egypt. And trust me, it's messier than your breakup texts and more dramatic than any Netflix series you've binge-watched. The Golden Age, the calm before the storm. Let's rewind to when Egypt was basically the iPhone of ancient civilizations. Everyone wanted one, but nobody could replicate it. We're talking about a kingdom that lasted longer than Christianity has existed. While your ancestors were still figuring out how to make fire without burning their eyebrows off, Egyptians were performing brain surgery and building monuments that would make modern architects weep. The Old Kingdom period, roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, was when Egypt was flexing harder than a gym bro on Instagram. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built during this time with precision that would make Swiss watchmakers jealous. Recent archaeological evidence from Dr. Mark Lehner's excavations shows these weren't built by slaves, but by skilled workers who got paid in beer and garlic. That's right, the greatest monuments in human history were built by people getting their daily dose of carbs and alcohol. Talk about work-life balance. But here's where it gets interesting, and where our first cracks begin to show. But what happens when paradise starts showing its first fault lines? What happens when the gods themselves seem to turn their backs on their chosen people? Hold that thought, because what came next would make the 2008 financial crisis look like a minor hiccup. First domino, climate catastrophe. Around 2200 BCE, Egypt got hit with what scientists now call the 4.2 kiloyear event, basically climate change's ancient evil twin. Core samples from the Nile Delta, analysed by Dr. Michael Crom and his team, show that the life-giving Nile floods, Egypt's entire economic lifeline, became as reliable as your Wi-Fi during a thunderstorm. Imagine if Amazon stopped delivering tomorrow. That's what happened to Egypt when the Nile said, nope. Hieroglyphic records from this period, found in tombs like that of Anktifi, literally describe people eating their own children. The texts read, "The whole of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger to such a degree that everyone had come to eating his children." This wasn't just a bad harvest. This was civilizational collapse 101. The Old Kingdom crumbled faster than a cookie and milk, leading to what historians dramatically call the First Intermediate Period. Think of it as Egypt's Dark Ages, but with more sand and existential dread. But Egypt wasn't going down without a fight. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, or should I say, from the desert sands, they came back swinging. But every comeback has a price, and this one would plant the seeds of their ultimate destruction. The warrior pharaohs, power and paranoia. Enter the Middle Kingdom pharaohs, Egypt's equivalent of that friend who hits the gym after a brutal breakup. They came back harder, stronger, and with serious trust issues. Pharaohs like Amenemhat, I literally built fortresses around their palaces, because apparently being a god king doesn't make you immune to assassination attempts. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs were like ancient Egypt's version of overprotective parents. They expanded the military, built massive fortifications, and created what archaeologist Dr. Aidan Dodson calls the world's first police state. Papyrus documents from La Hun show detailed surveillance records that would make the NSA proud. But here's the thing about paranoia. It's often justified. The Hyksos invasion around 1650 BCE proved that Egypt's worst fears were about to come true. These foreign rulers didn't just knock on Egypt's door. They kicked it down, moved in, and redecorated with horse-drawn chariots and bronze weapons that made Egyptian copper tools look like toys. The Hyksos ruled northern Egypt for over a century, and their legacy. They taught Egypt that to survive, you had to be the biggest, baddest empire on the block. This lesson would both save and doom ancient Egypt. The Hyksos invasion was Egypt's 9/11 moment. It changed everything. But what rose from this humiliation would be the most powerful Egypt had ever been, and the beginning of the end. Because sometimes, becoming too powerful is the most dangerous thing of all. The empire strikes back. Hubris and overextension. The New Kingdom pharaohs weren't just angry, they were absolutely livid. Think of them as ancient Egypt's version of John Wick, but instead of a dog, someone had messed with their entire civilization. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II didn't just want to defend Egypt, they wanted to conquer the known world. And boy, did they deliver. At its peak, the Egyptian empire stretched from Sudan to Syria, making it the superpower of the ancient world. Recent excavations at Amarna, led by Dr. Barry Kemp, have uncovered diplomatic correspondence showing Egypt receiving tribute from as far away as Babylon and Assyria. But here's where the plot thickens, and where Egypt made the classic mistake of every empire in history. They got drunk on their own power. Maintaining an empire isn't like winning a video game level. It's like juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle on a tightrope, over a pit of hungry crocodiles. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, where Ramesses II faced the Hittite Empire, shows us exactly how overconfident Egypt had become. Ramesses' own inscriptions describe him as single-handedly defeating thousands of enemies. Archaeological evidence from the battle site tells a very different story. It was basically a draw that nearly ended in Egyptian disaster. But empires don't fall from single battles. They death spiral from 1,000 cuts. And Egypt was about to discover that being the neighborhood tough guy makes you a target for every up-and-coming bully on the block. The Sea Peoples, Ancient Apocalypse. Around 1200 BCE, Egypt faced something that makes horror movies look like Disney films: the Sea Peoples. These weren't just raiders. They were a civilizational tsunami that wiped entire empires off the map. The Hittites, gone. The Mycenaeans, bye-bye. The Canaanites, see you later. Dr. Eric Klein's research on the Late Bronze Age collapse shows that this wasn't just warfare. It was systemic civilizational breakdown. Climate change, internal rebellions, and mass migrations created a perfect storm that destroyed the interconnected world of the ancient Mediterranean. Egypt survived, but just barely. Pharaoh Ramesses III's temple at Medinet Habu contains detailed reliefs showing these battles, and they're absolutely brutal. The inscriptions describe enemies coming from the midst of the sea, and no land could stand before their arms. This wasn't propaganda. Egyptian art was usually pretty conservative, so if they're showing chaos, things were really bad. The cost of victory was catastrophic. Egypt's economy was shattered, their empire lost, and their military exhausted. They won the battle, but lost the war. Surviving the Sea Peoples should have been Egypt's comeback story. Instead, it became the beginning of their slow-motion collapse. Because sometimes survival isn't victory, it's just postponing the inevitable. Priests, power, and civil war. By 1100 BCE, Egypt had developed a serious case of what we might call institutional cancer. The priests of Amun had become so powerful that they were basically running a shadow government. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of a corporate takeover, except the corporation was the afterlife. The Wilbur Papyrus, dating to this period, shows that temples controlled about 30% of Egypt's arable land. That's like if the Vatican owned a third of Italy, which, come to think of it, they kind of did at one point. The priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were economic powerhouses who could make or break pharaohs. This led to the surreal situation where Egypt split into two kingdoms, pharaohs in the north, high priests in the south. For 350 years, Egypt was basically having a very long, very expensive divorce. Archaeological evidence from Thebes shows temples being fortified like military compounds, while royal monuments were being systematically defaced. The late period pharaohs were pharaohs in name only. They were more like CEOs trying to manage a company where the board of directors was actively working against them. But even a divided Egypt might have survived if they'd been left alone. Unfortunately, the world had other plans. New superpowers were rising, and they looked at Egypt like a retirement home filled with treasure. The Persian takeover, foreign rule. In 525 BCE, Egypt got a reality check delivered by Cambyses II of Persia. This wasn't just a conquest. It was a hostile takeover by a civilization that had perfected the art of empire building. The Persians looked at Egypt's internal divisions and said, "Thanks for making our job easier." The Persian conquest was swift and brutal. Herodotus describes how Cambyses defeated the Egyptians at the Battle of Pelusium by using their own religious beliefs against them. He had his soldiers carry cats and other sacred animals as shields, knowing Egyptians would rather die than harm them. Whether this story is true or not, it perfectly captures how Egypt's spiritual strength became their tactical weakness. Under Persian rule, Egypt became a province. A really wealthy province, but still just a province. The Persians weren't interested in becoming Egyptian. They were interested in Egyptian gold, grain, and geographical position. For the first time in 3 millennia, Egypt was being governed by people who couldn't care less about pharaonic tradition. The Egyptians rebelled repeatedly, but each rebellion was crushed harder than the last. The Persian Empire had resources Egypt couldn't match, and administrative efficiency that made Egyptian bureaucracy look like amateur hour. Egypt's salvation seemed to come from the most unlikely source, a young Macedonian with delusions of grandeur and a serious case of daddy issues. But sometimes, being saved is just another way of being conquered. Alexander and the Ptolemies. Alexander the Great liberated Egypt from Persian rule in 332 BCE, and the Egyptians welcomed him like a rock star. Finally, a conqueror who at least pretended to respect Egyptian culture. Alexander visited the Oracle of Amun and was declared a god, because apparently that's what you do when you're having a midlife crisis at 24. But Alexander's death in 323 BCE left Egypt in the hands of Ptolemy I, who founded the last dynasty that would rule Egypt. The Ptolemies were Greek, spoke Greek, and created a hybrid Greco-Egyptian culture that was fascinating but fundamentally foreign. Here's the thing about the Ptolemies. They were incredibly smart, but also incredibly insular. They practiced brother-sister marriage to keep the bloodline pure, which led to exactly the kind of genetic problems you'd expect. By the time we get to Cleopatra VII, the royal family tree looked more like a telephone pole. The Ptolemies turned Egypt into a Hellenistic kingdom, complete with the famous Library of Alexandria and groundbreaking scientific advances. But they also turned Egypt into a client state, dependent on Mediterranean trade networks they couldn't control. The Ptolemies gave Egypt a brilliant final act, but by then, a new power was rising in the West, one that would make the Persians look like amateurs. Rome was coming, and they weren't interested in sharing the Mediterranean with anyone. The final curtain. Rome and the end of pharaonic Egypt. This brings us full circle to that moment we opened with. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, betting everything on a relationship with Mark Antony that would either save Egypt or destroy it. Spoiler alert, it destroyed it. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE wasn't just a naval battle, it was the final exam for Egyptian independence, and they failed spectacularly. Octavian, later Augustus, didn't just defeat Cleopatra, he absorbed Egypt into the Roman Empire so completely that it became Rome's personal breadbasket. When Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, 3,000 years of pharaonic rule died with her. Egypt became a Roman province, then a Byzantine province, then an Islamic conquest, then an Ottoman territory, then a British protectorate. The land of the pharaohs had become a footnote in other people's empires. The irony? Egypt's greatest strengths, its wealth, its strategic position, its cultural sophistication, are exactly what made it irresistible to conquerors. They didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they were too valuable to leave alone. The rise and fall of history's most magnificent civilization, told in 15 minutes of pure, concentrated historical chaos. Egypt didn't fall because of one catastrophic event. It fell because empires, like people, are mortal. They rise, they peak, they adapt, and eventually, they become someone else's history lesson. But here's the thing, Egypt's story isn't really about failure. It's about the price of greatness and the courage to keep fighting even when the odds are impossible. The pyramids are still standing, the hieroglyphs are still telling their stories, and we're still here 3,000 years later, absolutely mesmerized by what they accomplished. Remember, civilizations rise and fall, but the stories they leave behind are eternal. Now go forth and impress people at parties with your newfound knowledge of ancient Egyptian political drama. If this deep dive into ancient Egyptian drama was your cup of tea, or should I say, your cup of ancient Egyptian beer, smash that like button harder than a pyramid block hitting the ground. Subscribe for more historical chaos that will make your history teacher weep tears of joy and confusion. And drop a comment below. Which civilizations rise and fall should we destroy next? Because trust me, there are plenty more empire-sized disasters where this came from.